I've dealt with some truly outrageous cases in my time as an attorney. Corporate battles over the placement of a single comma. Family feuds involving porcelain cat figurines worth more than a brand new luxury vehicle, and contracts so twisted they'd make a sphinx's riddle seem like a bedtime story. But nothing could have prepared me for the one time I was actually sued because my property, specifically my mailbox, supposedly failed in its sacred duty to crumble gracefully when struck by a car. Yes, that absurd war was declared by none other than my own homeowners association. Buckle up, because this tale of suburban chaos is as ridiculous as it is real. And before we dive in, do me a quick favor, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because apparently these HOA dramas resonate across the globe. It all kicked off when I finally realized a lifelong dream: buying land just far enough from the city to enjoy an unpolluted view of the stars. It wasn't a grand Texas-style ranch, just a peaceful 10-acre plot in a semi-rural neighborhood I'll call Whispering Pines Estates, a name dripping with irony, since there were barely any pines and the only thing whispering was the non-stop HOA gossip mill. My goal was simple: peace, space, and the ability to build a workshop bigger than my cramped city apartment. Sure, I'm a lawyer by profession, but in my soul, I'm a builder. There's nothing like the scent of fresh sawdust and the feel of a sturdy tool in hand. That's why buying the land wasn't just about acquiring a house. It was about embracing a project. I spent the first year reinforcing fences, over-engineering a chicken coop strong enough to withstand a Category 3 hurricane, and generally molding the place into something that truly felt like mine. And then came the mailbox, the final piece of my initial setup. The original was a sad, rust-eaten metal box perched on a crumbling wooden post, practically begging to be taken out by the elements. And sure enough, during that first winter, the county snowplow, like clockwork in its annual display of dominance, sideswiped it and launched it into a frozen ditch. I hauled it back, patched it up, and stuck it back in the ground. 2 weeks later, then came another heavy snowfall, and with it, yet another vehicular decapitation of my poor, beleaguered mailbox. Clearly, this was no longer a sustainable model for receiving mail. It wasn't about stubbornness or making a statement anymore. It was simply about practicality. I'm a firm believer in doing a job once and doing it right, so I headed into my workshop determined to end this saga for good. I sourced a steel pipe 6 inches in diameter and 4 inches thick, then dug a hole 4 feet deep, carefully measuring the distance from the road's edge 3 separate times. Because that's just the kind of meticulous person I am. I dropped the steel pipe into place and filled the entire cavity with 200 pounds of high-strength concrete, effectively creating an immovable subterranean anchor. To that unyielding post, I welded a thick steel plate and on top of that, mounted the largest, heaviest gauge USPS-approved mailbox I could find, all finished in a sleek matte black. It wasn't just functional, it was, in my view, a piece of industrial art. It was solid, indestructible, and could probably take a direct hit from a snowplow, a rogue deer, or even a low-flying meteor without flinching. But what I hadn't accounted for in my risk assessment was the spectacular incompetence of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association Security Patrol. That particular outfit was the creation of one Bartholomew Bart Higgins, a man whose life seemingly reached its apex the day someone handed him a fluorescent yellow vest and a walkie-talkie. A retired mall security guard, Bart exuded the grim, overinflated self-importance of someone who had witnessed one too many teenage attempts to steal Axe body spray and now saw himself as the last line of suburban defense. Unofficially dubbed the HOA's Chief of Security, a title he likely invented himself, Bart patrolled his self-declared kingdom from the front seat of the Whispering Pines Interceptor, which in reality was a 20th car, was painted a nondescript civilian white. but Bart had gone to great lengths to transform it into his Suburban patrol chariot. He'd plastered it with stick-on security decals that were already curling at the edges and mounted a flimsy amber light bar ordered from some questionable online catalog, which he activated with unsettling enthusiasm for infractions as trivial as someone leaving their trash can out an hour past pickup time. His sidekick was Lenny, a timid, constantly anxious man who played the part of loyal deputy, nodding along dutifully and scribbling observations into a battered spiral notebook like he was chronicling the fall of Rome. Together, they were mostly a neighborhood punchline, a slow-rolling comedy duo, equal parts annoyance and entertainment until the day they came face-to-face with my mailbox. It was a clear, beautiful Saturday afternoon, and I was in my workshop, blissfully sorting drill bits by size when I heard it, not just a crash, but a metallic thunderclap followed by the tortured groan of crumpling steel and the crystalline tinkle of shattered glass. It was the kind of sound that stops time. I rushed outside, and there, nose first into my mailbox post, was the H.O.A. security interceptor, its front bumper mangled into a sad V, the hood buckled like crumpled foil. One headlight shattered, and a fluorescent greenish fluid slowly puddling beneath it like a wounded beast bleeding out. My mailbox, on the other hand, stood proud and unshaken, immaculate, unmoved, and bearing only a small scuff mark that I was fairly certain would buff out. Bart and Lenny stumbled out of the wreck like dazed cartoon characters. Bart's face was a furious tapestry of rage and humiliation, his clip-on tie askew, his cheeks an alarming shade of plum. Lenny looked like he'd just seen a ghost, or worse, a physics-defying mailbox. "What in the blazes is this thing made of?" Bart roared, jabbing an accusatory finger at the unyielding post. Then, in a burst of frustrated bravado, he kicked it with his foot, a decision he immediately regretted as he began hopping in pain, clutching his toes, and howling with the wounded pride of a man who had just lost a war he didn't know he'd started. "You see this?" Bart shouted, gesturing dramatically toward his wounded Crown Vic like it was a fallen comrade on a battlefield. "You see what your thing did to official HOA property?" I took a long, deliberate sip of the coffee I'd brought out with me, letting the silence stretch just enough before responding in the calmest, most measured tone I could summon. "From where I'm standing, Bart, it looks like your official HOA property drove directly into my thing. Are you two okay?" The question, intended as a small olive branch, only seemed to stoke the fire burning behind his reddened face. "Okay? Okay? My vehicle is disabled. We were in pursuit," he barked, puffing himself up with misplaced authority. I raised an eyebrow, more curious than confrontational. "In pursuit of what exactly?" That's when Lenny, poor skittish Lenny, finally piped up in a voice barely above a whisper, "There was a squirrel, sir. It was jaywalking. Darted right out." I stared at him, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Lenny immediately averted his eyes and began studying a nearby crack in the pavement as if it contained the secrets of the universe. A jaywalking squirrel, that was their story, and apparently they were sticking to it. Regaining some of his wounded pride, Bart stomped closer, puffing out his chest like a cartoon sheriff. "This mailbox is a hazard," he growled. "It's a weapon. It's illegally constructed. You've built a fortress on the public right-of-way, and we're going to have to issue you a citation." I glanced from him to the battered remains of his makeshift patrol vehicle, then back at the unscathed mailbox, which stood like a silent, smug sentinel in the face of this absurd standoff. Car, and a slow, amused smile crept across my face as it all suddenly clicked. This was going to be far more entertaining than organizing drill bits. "You do that, Bart," I said with casual cheer, turning back toward the house. "Write your little citation. And make sure you spell my name correctly on the lawsuit that's inevitably going to follow. I'd hate for it to get dismissed on a technicality." His jaw dropped, the color draining from his already flustered face as it dawned on him that he had catastrophically misjudged the situation. He saw a weekend hobbyist in a Sawdust Street shirt, not realizing he just plowed his H.O.A. clown car into the immovable steel post of a man who argues complex litigation for a living. The game was on, and I already knew with the certainty of a well-poured concrete foundation that I was going to win. The H.O.A.'s first official volley came a week later, and it wasn't the handwritten citation Bart had so confidently promised. No, it was a thick, professionally printed envelope complete with an official letterhead that oozed bureaucratic gall. The letter, signed by H.O.A. President Gerald Finney, Bart's golfing buddy and longtime enabler, outlined a list of charges so audacious I had to read them twice. According to Gerald, my mailbox was in violation of Article 7, Section 4 of the Whispering Pines Covenants, citing offenses like being overly fortified, visually aggressive, and failing to conform to the neighborhood's ideal of quaint, yielding roadside accoutrements. That was only the beginning. The letter demanded two things. First, that I immediately dismantle my non-compliant mailbox structure and replace it with a prefab model selected from a list of vendors I later discovered who conveniently gave Gerald a tidy little kickback on every purchase. Second, and this part genuinely made me laugh out loud, I was being held financially responsible for the repairs to the security interceptor totaling a jaw-dropping $4,782.31. Attached was an itemized invoice from a local auto body shop that, wouldn't you know it, just happened to be owned by Gerald's brother-in-law. I read the letter 3 times, not out of confusion, but to fully savor the sheer, unfiltered audacity of it all. They weren't just denying fault for the wreck. They were retroactively blaming my property for their own spectacular incompetence. Like someone tripping over a sidewalk crack and then suing the concrete for not being soft enough. They crashed their car into my mailbox and had the nerve to send me the bill. I had to admire the boldness of the strategy in the same way you might marvel at a raccoon trying to hotwire a car completely irrational, yet oddly ambitious. My first instinct was to laugh, but my second, far stronger instinct kicked in almost immediately. Head into my office, fire up my laptop, and do what I do best: build a case with surgical precision. As an attorney, I live by a simple creed. Trust, but verify everything, and when trust runs out, just verify. I wasn't going to merely defend myself. I was going to dismantle their argument piece by ridiculous piece. My investigation began with the basics. I pulled up the official USPS mailbox installation guidelines, and as I expected, their regulations focus solely on the box's height above the road, its distance from the pavement's edge, and whether it was an approved design. There was no mention, none whatsoever, of any upper limit on structural strength for the supporting post. In fact, several official rural installation guides actually recommended using reinforced materials, like steel and concrete, to avoid destruction from snowplows and roadside debris. I printed the most relevant sections, highlighted them in bright yellow, and filed them neatly into a folder I labeled H.O.A. versus the Mailbox of Doom. Then I went deeper. I pulled the subdivision's public records from the county office, including the plat maps and official right-of-way designations, then used a surveyor's tape to measure the exact distance from the edge of the county road to the center of my mailbox post. It was 3 inches beyond the required setback, meaning I'd actually provided more clearance than legally necessary. I took time-stamped photographs of the measurement from several angles, printed them out, and added them to my growing file. With the momentum building, I made my next stop, a visit to the County Road Commission. I spoke with a delightfully cantankerous old county engineer named Stan, a man who had spent the past 4 decades mediating the petty civil wars of suburban life. And when I explained that my HOA was claiming my mailbox was a road hazard because it didn't crumble under the majestic impact of their security patrol vehicle, he let out a long, wheezing laugh that echoed through his dusty office like a man who had finally heard a new joke. "Son," he said, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes, "if every time a car left the road and hit a mailbox it turned into a lawsuit, we'd all be bankrupt by Tuesday. We tell people to build them strong, it saves us a headache. As long as it's off the roadway, it's not our problem." Sounds to me like their problem is with their driver. And just like that, Stan happily drafted and signed a letter on official county letterhead, stating unequivocally that my mailbox's placement was in full compliance with all local codes and ordinances. That golden document went straight into my growing file right on top of the USPS regulations, forming the foundation of my case like legal bedrock. Finally, I turned my attention to the HOA's own governing documents, the same weapon they'd tried to brandish against me. I brewed a strong pot of coffee and spent the evening trudging through the 100-page tome of mind-numbing suburban restrictions, lawn height regulations, acceptable fence colors, and even a baffling prohibition on garden gnome placement. Eventually, I found Article 7, Section 4, the clause they'd cited, which, as I suspected, was a vague masterpiece of homeowner micromanagement, filled with subjective phrases like harmonious aesthetic and in keeping with the character of the community. It was a textbook catch-all, the kind power-hungry HOA boards adore for its ability to mean anything or nothing at all. But it lacked one crucial thing: measurable standards. Nowhere did it specify materials, post diameters, structural limits, or even installation depth. Legally speaking, it was too ambiguous to enforce. But then I stumbled upon something even better buried deep in an appendix on winter preparedness. Added 5 years ago after a particularly brutal snow season was this glorious little sentence: residents on county-maintained roads are encouraged to ensure their mailboxes are securely installed to prevent damage from snow removal operations. There it was in black and white, from their own governing documents, confirmation that not only was my mailbox compliant, it was exactly what they had encouraged residents to build. Done. This wasn't just solid evidence, it was irony distilled to its purest form, poetic justice straight from the HOA's own bylaws. I photocopied the page, circled that beautiful sentence in bold red ink, and slipped it proudly into my now bulging folder of legal ammunition. But the piece de resistance, the final and most damning piece of the puzzle, was already in my possession. You see, when I'd installed my new home security system, I deliberately angled one of the high-definition cameras to cover my entire front yard, including the road out front, a decision that, in hindsight, felt downright prophetic. I pulled up the footage from the day of the incident, scrubbed it through to the exact timestamp, and watched the event unfold in glorious 108p on my widescreen monitor. And let me tell you, it was even better than I remembered. The video clearly showed the HOA security interceptor barreling down the street at a speed that was laughably over the posted 25 miles per hour limit. There was no sign of a jaywalking squirrel, no sudden evasive maneuver, no last-second swerve to avoid disaster. What there was, however, was Bart, one hand on the steering wheel, the other juggling a large soda, while also fiddling with the radio and shouting something at poor Lenny. For a full 5 seconds, Bart wasn't even looking at the road. During that time, the car drifted lazily but unavoidably to the right, like a ship with no captain, heading straight for my immovable mailbox. The impact was abrupt, jarring, and, knowing what I knew, absolutely hilarious. Even better, the camera, picked up every word that came after. Art's voice rang out, "My soda," followed by an impressive string of creative curses. Then came the real gem, a whispered scramble to invent an excuse. "We'll say we were avoiding something," Bart said. "A dog? No. A squirrel." "Yeah, a squirrel. And this thing is built like a tank. He can't do that. We'll blame the mailbox." There it was, on tape, in perfect clarity. Not only proof of negligence, but of a premeditated lie, concocted on the spot and sealed with spilled soda. It was the smoking gun, a signed, videotaped confession set to the accidental soundtrack of their own idiocy, complete with the clatter of a dropped soda and a panicked brainstorming session on how to rewrite reality. I backed up the footage to 3 separate hard drives and a secure cloud server, ensuring it would live on even if my house were struck by lightning, flooded, and overrun by raccoons simultaneously. My case was now not just solid, it was bulletproof. I had federal guidelines, county ordinances, HOA documents, and crystal clear video proof of their negligence and their casual conspiracy to lie about it. I sat down and drafted my response, not a pleading, not an apology, but a meticulously structured legal counteroffensive written in the cold, precise tone of someone who argues for a living. Point by point, I dismantled their claims, citing every regulation, photograph, timestamp, and clause in my arsenal. I denied all liability, formally rejected their laughable demand for nearly $5,000, and then delivered my own shot across the bow. I informed them that my mailbox had sustained minor cosmetic damage and that I possessed recorded footage of the entire incident, including the negligent driving and their immediately documented attempt to fabricate a cover story. I made it crystal clear. Should they pursue this matter any further, I would not only defend myself vigorously, but would also file a counterclaim for damages, attorney's fees calculated at my full professional rate, and punitive damages for malicious prosecution and the filing of a frivolous lawsuit. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested, directly to HOA President Gerald Finney. The ball was in their court, and frankly, I expected a quiet, red-faced withdrawal. But once again, I had underestimated the ferocious stupidity and arrogance that seemed to flow through the veins of Whispering Pines leadership like cheap wine at a PTA mixer. 2 weeks later, a process server arrived at my door, documents in hand. The HOA was officially suing me. Being sued by your own homeowners association is a surreal experience. It's like your dog slapping you with a cease and desist because you bought the off-brand kibble, and the complaint? Even more absurd than their opening salvo. The letter, when it finally arrived, was even more absurd than I'd imagined. Their attorney, a man whose name I recognized from low-budget bus bench ads with slogans like, "Injured? Call Rick," had somehow managed to wrap their laughable claims in enough legal jargon to almost make them sound legitimate. The lawsuit alleged negligence on my part for creating a hazardous and immovable obstruction, claimed that my mailbox constituted a private nuisance, and best of all, accused me of violating a duty of care by not ensuring that my personal property would disintegrate upon impact. Yes, they were seriously arguing, in an actual court filing, that my mailbox should have been weaker. It was a legal theory so wildly inventive, so completely devoid of precedent, that I had to briefly pause and marvel at the creative audacity almost. Any trace of amusement quickly hardened into cold, focused resolve. What began as a petty squabble had now escalated into a formal legal assault, and that was a battlefield I knew intimately. Typically, representing yourself or going pro se is something lawyers caution against, citing the old adage that a man who represents himself has a fool for a client. But this wasn't a labyrinthine corporate case or a high-stakes criminal defense. This was a glorified fender bender dressed up in HOA drama and drenched in petty vengeance. More importantly, it was personal. Hiring another attorney would have felt like outsourcing my own vindication. This was my case, and I was going to win it myself. So I rolled up my sleeves, sat down, and drafted my official answer and counterclaim, my formal legal response to the HOA's nonsense. For every flimsy accusation they threw at me, I responded with clear, unequivocal denials, backing each one with precise references to USPS guidelines, county ordinances, photographic evidence, and of course, the incriminating video. I denied any negligence, dismissed the claim of nuisance, and flatly rejected the laughable notion that I had any legal obligation to design my mailbox for self-destruction. And then came the satisfying part, the counterclaim. I was now suing them, and count one was for property damage. The cost to have the steel post professionally sanded, primed, and repainted, plus the replacement of the mailbox that now bore the emotional trauma of its brush with H.O.A. idiocy, came out to a modest $250, a paltry sum by legal standards, but it wasn't about the money. It was the principle. Count two of my counterclaim was for malicious prosecution, asserting that the H.O.A., specifically Bart and Gerald, knew full well their claim had no merit, knew their vehicle was at fault thanks to the damning audio in my video, and yet chose to pursue a lawsuit anyway purely to harass and pressure me into footing the bill for their own incompetence. Count three was for filing a frivolous lawsuit, which in our state allows the court to award sanctions, including attorney's fees. And since I was representing myself, I made it clear I would be billing for my time at my standard professional rate of $450 per hour, every email, every filing. Every second spent dismantling their paper-thin case was logged meticulously in a running timesheet. Their petty $4,700 claim was about to become a five-figure life lesson. With the initial pleadings in, the case moved into the discovery phase, the part of litigation where each side demands evidence from the other, and where lawsuits built on lies often collapse before ever reaching trial. I served them with my first set of interrogatories, a precise barrage of written questions they were required to answer under oath, followed by a request for production of documents. My demands were surgical and comprehensive. All training materials, manuals, and certifications for the H.O.A. Security Patrol, which I strongly suspected didn't exist. Full maintenance records for the Crown Victoria, which I assumed were barely legible receipts stuffed in a glove box. And most eagerly, the official incident report filed by Bart and Lenny. I was dying to see how the story of the phantom jaywalking squirrel held up under sworn testimony. I also requested the personal driving records of both Bartholomew Higgins and Lenny Petrovsky, as their fitness to operate any vehicle, let alone one with flashing lights and H.O.A. logos, was now a central part of the case. The ability of Bart and Lenny to safely operate a vehicle fate patrol car, or not, was now a central issue, and the H.O.A.'s response to my discovery requests was a masterclass in panic deflection. Their attorney fired back a barrage of boilerplate objections, claiming my demands were overly broad, unduly burdensome, and not reasonably calculated to lead to the discovery of admissible evidence, the legal equivalent of clamping your hands over your ears and yelling, "Allah, Allah," in hopes it all just goes away. I wasn't having it. I filed a motion to compel, asking the court to order full compliance. And soon we were in a teleconference hearing with the judge, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for slicing through legal fluff like a hot knife through butter. She read through the case summary and my sharply written motion, then listened to the H.O.A.'s lawyer mumble and stumble through his argument for all of 90 seconds before cutting him off mid-sentence. "Counsel," she said, her tone flat and unimpressed, Your client drove their vehicle into a stationary object on private property and is now suing the owner of that object. The driver's record and training or lack thereof aren't just relevant, they're the entire ballgame. Produce the documents. And with that, she gave them 10 days. What they turned over was even better than I could have imagined. There were no training manuals, no SOPs, no certifications, just a flimsy paper trail that practically screamed amateur hour. The incident report was a single handwritten paragraph by Bart, scribbled on lined notebook paper, referencing a sudden, high-speed squirrel and describing my mailbox as an unmarked hardened fortification, like it was a Cold War bunker hiding on the side of the road. The maintenance records for the Crown Victoria revealed it was 3,000 miles overdue for an oil change and had a long-standing issue with pulling to the right, an issue they'd repeatedly failed to fix. And then came the driving records. Lenny's was spotless unsurprisingly, but Bart's? Bart's was a work of tragicomic brilliance. 2 speeding tickets in the last 3 years, both issued within Whispering Pines estates, and the crown jewel a documented at-fault accident from 4 years prior where he rear-ended a car at a red light and later claimed his brakes had mysteriously failed. The insurance investigator at the time concluded that Bart Higgins was likely distracted, which sadly wasn't surprising. It fit a pattern. Bart wasn't just a mall cop suffering from a messiah complex. He had a documented history of being an absolutely reckless driver. While this mountain of evidence was compelling, I knew the real turning point in this battle would be the depositions. Depositions are sworn testimonies taken outside of court essentially, a high-stakes interview where every word is recorded by a court reporter. They're designed to pin people down, expose contradictions, and extract damaging admissions that can later be used in court to unravel a case. I had 3 lined up: Gerald Finney, the overzealous H.O.A. president, Lenny Petrovsky, the silent passenger, and the main attraction himself, Bartholomew Bart Higgins. My plan was simple: get them in one room, look them in the eye, and dismantle their fabricated narrative piece by piece. I had my secret weapon ready, a crucial video clip from my home security camera, loaded up and waiting on my laptop like a grenade with the pin pulled. I felt oddly calm, even focused as I prepared. They had waged a battle of paperwork and veiled threats, but they were about to experience what it's like to be cross-examined by a professional. The depositions were set to take place in a neutral, downtown office building inside a cold, corporate conference room. The space was dull and sterile, featuring a long mahogany table, a forgettable coffee urn, and a heavy tension in the air. I arrived early, arranging my laptop and organizing my materials with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before. Each exhibit was carefully labeled. Exhibit A was a county zoning map. Exhibit B detailed USPS delivery regulations. Exhibit C included the HOA's own rules with key sections highlighted, and so on. But the crown jewel, the irrefutable video evidence, sat minimized on my desktop, quietly waiting for its dramatic reveal. Soon after, their lawyer arrived. A wiry and somewhat harried man named Dave, flanked by his clients. Gerald Finney, the HOA... Gerald Finney, the HOA president, looked like someone who had been forcefully poured into a golf shirt one size too small, desperately trying to project an air of bored confidence while his eyes betrayed a frantic, jittery anxiety. Lenny Petrovsky, on the other hand, had the haunted look of a man heading to his own execution. He gripped his spiral notebook as if it were a sacred artifact and avoided eye contact with everyone in the room. Then Bart walked in, strutting with a forced swagger, draped in a cheap blazer bearing the Whispering Pines security patch sewn onto the chest, an outfit as fake as his confidence. He took his seat across from me, folded his arms, and tried to glare me down with what he likely imagined was intimidation, though it felt more like being stared at by a particularly annoyed garden gnome. We began with Gerald, placing him under oath. I walked him through his official title, his relationship with Bart, and had him confirm that the HOA's decision to sue rested entirely on Bart's version of events. "Did you ever conduct an independent investigation into the crash, Mr. Finney?" I asked. "I trust my security chief," he replied, puffing up. His report was very thorough. I held up a photocopy of the so-called report handwritten on notebook paper, complete with a mention of a high-speed squirrel. "Did you try to contact any other witnesses?" I pressed. "There were no other witnesses," he declared with confidence. "Did you review any video evidence?" I asked, watching his face closely. "There was no video evidence to review," he responded, just a little too fast. I jotted a quiet note on my legal pad. He was already lying under oath, and he didn't even realize it. Then came Lenny. He looked ready to collapse. The court reporter had to ask him to raise his voice 3 separate times. I chose not to pressure him instead. I treated him like a man caught in something much bigger than himself. I kept the questions basic, chronological, designed to ease him in gently. "What time did you begin your patrol that day?" I asked, carefully opening the door to what would soon unravel everything. Where had they been right before the crash? What were they talking about? As I gently pressed Lenny with these questions, he kept nervously glancing at Bart, who was now doubling down on his furious garden gnome glare, trying to intimidate him into silence. Mr. Higgins was, adjusting the radio, Lenny stammered, and he had a beverage. A big gulp, I think. I leaned in slightly. So, at that moment, he wasn't watching the road? I asked in a soft, measured tone. Lenny's eyes widened with panic. He turned toward Dave, the HOA Zalier, who simply sighed and rubbed his temples like a man who knew the damage was already done. I can't recall specifically, Lenny mumbled, retreating into a haze of deliberate vagueness, the kind coached in long, painful prep sessions. It was fine. I didn't need him to outright confess anything. I just needed him to lay down a story that contradicted what I was certain Bart would later claim. And then, it was time. Bart took center stage, plopping into the chair with a theatrical huff as the court reporter swore him in. I let the silence linger, letting the tension thicken in the air before striking. "Mr. Higgins," I began, "what professional training have you received in either law enforcement or vehicle operation?" He puffed up with pride. "I have 12 years in private security. I've done everything from crowd control to loss prevention." I nodded. "So just to confirm, no police academy, no post-certification, no formal advanced driver training?" "The School of Hard Knocks is the best training there is," he declared smugly. I paused, scribbling down the phrase as if it were evidence. "I see. The School of Hard Knocks. Does that school include instruction on the proper methods of investigating a traffic collision?" "It's just common sense," he scoffed, clearly unaware that he had already begun walking himself into a corner from which there was no return. Bart snapped when I pressed him, launching into his theatrical retelling of the crash like a bad actor auditioning for a low-budget crime reenactment. He described the kamikaze squirrel with exaggerated gestures and dramatic flair. It was a flash of gray fur, a suicidal rodent. I had a split second to react. My training kicked in. I swerved to save its life and in doing so, made contact with the plaintiff's illegal barricade. I raised an eyebrow. "A barricade? You mean my mailbox?" "Call it what you want," he barked. "It's a concrete and steel weapon planted by the side of the road. Mr. Higgins, are you aware of the county and USPS regulations concerning mailbox construction and placement?" I asked evenly. He puffed out his chest again. "I follow the HOA regulations, which supersede all others in Whispering Pines." he declared, a statement so flagrantly incorrect it made Dave, the HOS lawyer, visibly wince. I let Bart keep digging, nudging him into confirming, under oath, the key details of his narrative, that he was going exactly the speed limit, 25 miles per hour, and that he had full, undivided attention on the road. My eyes were peeled, he insisted, and the squirrel's appearance was sudden, instantaneous, unavoidable. With his story now cemented in the official record, it was time to unveil the truth. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice with deliberate calm. Mr. Higgins, I'd like to direct your attention to the laptop in front of me. I turned the screen so he and his attorney could see it. Dave leaned in, already bracing himself. Frozen on the screen was a still frame from my home security footage captured just seconds before the crash. The image showed Bart, unmistakably. In the driver's seat of the Crown Victoria, his head turned completely away from the windshield, one hand fiddling with the radio, the other wrapped around a comically oversized soda cup. I'm going to play a short video for you, I said, knowing this was the moment everything began to unravel. Marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit G for the record. Please watch carefully, I said, then hit play. The quiet, sterile conference room was suddenly filled with the ambient sounds of the security footage engine hum, faint radio music, and then, unmistakably, Bart's own voice. We all watched in real time as the Crown Victoria drifted lazily across the road, veering without urgency or cause. The impact played out clearly, followed by Bart's irritated yell about his spilled soda. But the real nail in the coffin came just seconds later, the incriminating conversation, captured in crystal clear audio. We'll say we were avoiding something. A squirrel. We'll blame the mailbox. The video cut to black. I didn't say a word. No one did. The silence that followed was thick and unbearable, like a vacuum pulling the air out of the room. Bart had turned from bright red to a sickly, clammy shade of white. He stared at the laptop screen, jaw slack, blinking like he couldn't believe what he'd just seen. Gerald Finney looked physically ill, slumped in his chair as if gravity had betrayed him. Dave, their beleaguered lawyer, removed his glasses slowly, cleaned them with a sigh so deep it seemed to echo off the walls, and replaced them with the resigned expression of a man who had just watched his entire case go up in flames. I finally broke the silence. Mr. Higgins, is that you in the video? No response. Mr. Higgins, I repeated, you are under oath. Is that you driving the vehicle? The angle is misleading, he muttered, his voice brittle. Is that your voice on the recording, Mr. Higgins? The one we hear planning to fabricate a story about a squirrel to conceal your negligence? That was the moment Dave intervened, his voice low and exhausted, stepping in to try and salvage whatever smoldering pieces remained. I think we're going to take a short break, Dave whispered, his voice barely audible as the weight of the moment settled on him. He grabbed Bart by the arm, motioned to Gerald, and practically dragged both of them out of the room. From the hallway, I could hear the muffled chaos of their panicked argument, frantic, disorganized, desperate. I sat back and took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the lukewarm, bitter conference room coffee. It had never tasted so good. The case was effectively over, even if they didn't fully realize it yet. The shouting match outside continued for nearly 20 minutes. When Dave finally returned, he was alone and looked like he'd aged 10 years in that hallway. He collapsed into his chair, set his briefcase on the floor like it weighed 100 pounds, and met my gaze with the empty stare of a man whose defense had just been annihilated. My clients retract their previous testimony, he muttered, which in lawyer speak meant, my clients are liars and we just got caught. His eyes dropped to my notepad, where I was calmly scribbling down billable hours with a practiced hand. What do you want? He asked, not a challenge, but a plea. Here's what's going to happen, I said, leaning in with quiet authority. First, your clients are going to sign a motion for voluntary dismissal with prejudice of all claims against me. I let the words sink in. With prejudice means they can never, under any circumstances, bring this lawsuit back. He nodded slowly, already beaten. Second, the HOA will pay my counterclaim in full, $250 for the repair of my mailbox plus my documented legal fees for enduring this entire circus. I flipped the notepad around. As of now, that total is $9,825. Dave, mid-sip, choked on his coffee. $9,000 for a mailbox? He sputtered. I smiled just a little. No, Dave, I said gently. It's for filing a frivolous, malicious lawsuit based on documented perjury, I said, my voice calm but resolute. My time isn't free. They wanted to play lawyers, so now they get to pay lawyer prices. Consider it an extremely expensive educational seminar. Dave didn't argue. He knew better. Third, I continued, the HOA will draft and issue a formal written apology to me, signed by every board member acknowledging the harassment and baseless accusations. That letter will be posted publicly on the community bulletin board for no fewer than 30 days. His eyes widened at that, but he didn't object. He had no leverage left, no defense to mount. And fourth, I said, pausing for effect, Whispering Pines Estates HOA Security Patrol is to be permanently disbanded, effective immediately. The faux police interceptor will be stripped of its lights and decals and sold off, with the proceeds returned to the HOA General Fund. This last point wasn't up for negotiation. It was personal, and it was about far more than me. It was about dismantling the petty regime of a self-appointed enforcer who had been bullying residents over garden gnomes, trash can placement, and holiday decorations. Dave simply nodded again, staring blankly at the glossy surface of the conference table like it might offer him some kind of escape. I'll draw up the settlement agreement, I told him. You'll have it by the end of the day. He gathered his briefcase and papers like a man moving through fog and shuffled out without another word. The war was over. The lawsuit was dead, but something still didn't sit right. There was one loose end that justice hadn't tied up yet. Because Bart and Lenny hadn't just filed a bogus lawsuit, they had recklessly operated a vehicle, then lied about it under oath, and tried to cover it all up when caught. And Bart in particular had a well-documented habit of this kind of reckless behavior. That night, after finalizing the settlement that would blow a crater in the HOA's annual budget, I began compiling a clean, airtight little package, neat, damning, and impossible to ignore. Inside was a crisp, high-definition copy of the security video, a certified transcript of Bart's deposition, a copy of his checkered driving record, and a calmly worded cover letter laying out the facts and context with professional detachment. I wasn't filing a lawsuit or demanding charges. I was simply being a responsible citizen, handing over clear, documented evidence of unsafe and dishonest behavior by licensed drivers in our community. One envelope went to the local police chief, the other to the state DMV's driver conduct and review division. Then I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and waited. The fallout came quickly, and it was magnificent. The HOA board called an emergency meeting, and according to one resident, the shouting was loud enough to echo through the parking lot. Within 48 hours, the settlement agreement was signed. A courier arrived at my doorstep the next day with a check for $9,825. The sad little Crown Victoria, once Whispering Pines' rolling symbol of petty tyranny, was stripped of its fake law enforcement decals and parked in front of the HOA clubhouse with a for sale sign stuck in the windshield. Meanwhile, the formal apology, typed in a desperate flourish on expensive letterhead, was pinned to the community bulletin board, where it was photographed, circulated, and gleefully dissected by every resident who had ever found a passive-aggressive note on their door from Bart. Then, about 3 weeks later, came the final stroke of justice. I received a call from Carol, a kind neighbor and quiet supporter throughout the mess, and she was practically in tears from laughing. "You are not going to believe this," she said. "I just saw Bart Higgins walking to the grocery store." Walking. She asked him about his car, and he turned beet red before muttering that the state had placed his license on a brief sabbatical. Turns out, the DMV took the evidence very seriously. Bart's on-record confession to distracted driving, combined with his prior offenses and the video-backed proof of perjury, was more than enough. His license was suspended for a full year due to reckless operation and moral turpitude. Lenny, for his part in the cover-up, received a 6-month suspension of his own. Justice had arrived, not loud, not flashy, but thoroughly, perfectly, and irrevocably. The chief of the Whispering Pines Security Patrol and his ever-faithful sidekick were officially grounded, and the irony was so rich you could slice through it with a butter knife. The source of their imaginary authority, their ability to cruise around in a faux patrol car, handing out warnings and glares like dollar store dictators, was gone. Their reign of petty intimidation didn't end in flames or courtroom drama. It ended with the quiet shame of having to bum a ride. The very next HOA meeting shattered attendance records, as residents packed the clubhouse like it was election night, and in a way, it was. Gerald Finney was swiftly and unceremoniously ousted as president and replaced by Carol, the same neighbor who had gleefully reported Bart's new pedestrian status. She promised transparency, accountability, and an immediate end to the board's obsession with frivolous power plays. Under her leadership, the HOA bylaws were revised with specific, unambiguous language, scrubbing out the vague clauses that had allowed the previous board to govern by personal vendetta. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to change. The atmosphere shifted from one of fear and suspicion to something warmer, more collaborative. People talked to each other again. There were fewer complaint letters, more waves and hellos, fewer passive-aggressive notes, and more genuine community spirit. Whispering Pines finally started to feel like the kind of place I had hoped it would be when I moved in. And as for my mailbox, it still stands proudly today, a sleek black sentinel of steel and concrete, unbent and unbroken. I polished out the scuff, and it looks brand new. Every now and then, when I walk out to collect the mail, I give it a light pat like one might pat the shoulder of an old friend. That mailbox stood its ground, both literally and symbolically. In the end, it did more to protect our neighborhoods, dignity and peace than any glorified mall cop ever could. They sued me because it was too strong. But the truth was, it wasn't the strength of the mailbox that upset them, it was that its strength exposed just how weak they really were. And for that, both I and the entire community of Whispering Pines will remain forever grateful.